Imagine a goat that is unhappy with its situation and which decides to take the matter to court. A goat before a human court. Imagine the plea. The goat explains what it's like to be a goat, because goats do have their own world. And every year, science teaches us more and more about these animal worlds, making them seem less dumb. But to really get the care and protection of humans, isn't it better to be a pet, docile and cute if possible? Does this rat have the same status if it lives in your cellar or in a laboratory? And when an animal is raised for food, does that change our obligations towards it? The rules are full of contradictions. Does the law do enough for our animal friends? They are conscious beings, sensitive to emotions and pain. Even fish can suffer, yet their interests are often overlooked. Isn't it time to redraw the lines? Take chicks, for example. Is it normal to kill newborn chicks simply because they have the bad luck to be the wrong sex for the food industry? This question was raised by the L214 Animal Defense Association during a court case against a hatchery in Brittany. The case was brought thanks to hidden camera footage that was widely viewed across the internet.
The chick is put straight into a bucket, like rubbish.
Killing unwanted chicks is allowed by law, but it's how they are killed that is the problem here.
That's the other part, when the chicks are suffocated in rubbish bags.
The law states they should be killed quickly with the least suffering possible. But in this hatchery, thousands of chicks are suffocated in plastic bags.
So this flies in the face of the law, which requires instant death, and we can see the chicks take time to die in dreadful suffering.
These chicks are killed because they belong to a breed of laying chickens. As adults, they wouldn't provide good meat. And because they are male, they will never lay. So they are killed and then crushed because the industry has no use for them.
In the world of animal protection, we've been aware for a long time that in terms of laying chickens, the males are sorted from the females and discarded. I've been working in animal rights for years and I've always known that. Except that when you actually show these images, it actually transforms things. It becomes concrete and can no longer be contested. With this trial, we also want to instigate a more general debate about the place of animals in our society. Is it legitimate to make animals suffer? I think everyone would agree that it isn't. But there's a kind of hidden suffering, a structured suffering, that is linked to how some animals are raised, transported, and slaughtered. And then there's the question about their actual death.
Let's be clear, the ethical problem of killing chicks was created by us human beings.
German lawyer Anne Peters is a specialist in international and animal law. She has studied the problem of the mass killing of newborn chicks. In her own country, the Minister for Agriculture recently tried to forbid the crushing of male chicks before being forced to make a U-turn for fear of breeders moving to other countries as a result.
The necessity to kill chicks is a financial issue. It's due to the fact that we raise different breeds. On the one hand, we want laying chickens that produce a lot of eggs, and on the other, chicks that grow up as quickly as possible so they can be sold for a profit. So the males become useless.
The fate of male chicks in the poultry farming industry is a powerful symbol of the ambiguous relationship we have with all sorts of animals. We raise them to eat them, but we are still moved by their fate. L214's video showing the slow and torturous death of chicks triggered a criminal investigation and trial.
That's an offence, and that's a crime. In terms of outcomes for complaints made by animal protection organisations, unfortunately they are often dismissed because they are dealing with issues regarding breeding, and that industry is really struggling at the moment. The tendency is to want to protect that sector of the economy and protect jobs, and in the name of protecting jobs, we completely ignore animals, despite them being creatures with feelings.
The court will rise.
This trial is an exception.
Thank you. The court is in session. Please be seated.
Because it serves as a test case. The hearing lasts for almost 4 hours. 4 hours to examine the practices of a hatchery that is now bankrupt and the ways many tens of thousands of chicks were put to death. Why weren't normal procedures respected? To save time? To save money? The judge grilled the director of the hatchery, but he consistently put the blame on his employees. This was the first time the fate of 50 million chicks crushed every year was raised in court. Eventually, the company was given a €19,000 fine. The company itself chose to stop hatching chicks in order to avoid crushing the males. Society thus officially recognized animal suffering after centuries of denial.
For some time, we ignored the sensitivities and suffering of animals and their mental states, so we could do what we wanted.
Boris Cyrulnik is a pioneering French ethologist or animal behaviorist. For someone who is also a psychiatrist and psychoanalyst, the problem society has with admitting animal suffering is deeply rooted in Western culture.
Animals were considered to be utterly non-human. This allowed us to categorize the living world and attribute a supernaturalness to mankind, allowing humans to control birds in the sky, mammals on land, and fish in the sea.
In the early 20th century in the West, animals paid a high price as a result of the Industrial Revolution. We widely exploited their capacity for hard work and their bodies. As our societies became richer, the demand for meat grew. In the abattoirs of Chicago, the biggest in the world, a cow was slaughtered every 8 seconds and a pig every 5. The race for productivity destroyed traditional animal rearing practices.
It was industry that widened the gap between humans and animals. And at that time, anything went. Unnecessary torture, unnecessary experiments, unnecessary massacres as innocently as you like. It wasn't considered a problem because machines were doing it.
Don't worry about it hurting them. Penicillin-injected rabbits are the healthiest in the world. They seem to enjoy their job of serving mankind.
After the Second World War, science also began to use animals on a huge scale. Experiments proved increasingly popular, with no thought for the animals. They were used to help us understand how our bodies work, sleep, vision, pain, how the nervous system functions, or even to prepare for a trip into space. These were the real pioneers of the space race.
After the trip, he's released from the canister, perfectly happy after his amazing experience and no ill effects at all.
Were these space pioneers really happy? Very few people raised any questions about the physical or psychological suffering of these chimpanzees. Yet the way we viewed these great apes would gradually change, thanks to a few women primate specialists. In 1958, in the Gombe Reserve in today's Tanzania, a young woman began observing chimpanzees.
When I got to Gombe, I had no scientific background. Nobody had told me how to study the chimpanzees, and so I used my own intuition. And gradually, I accumulated a whole lot of information. I got to know the chimpanzees as individuals.
She lived for months in immersion with the primates, naming each one. She discovered that chimps can make and use tools, care for each other, help each other, feel hate, fear, and love, and even make war. However, Jane Goodall's university tutors initially refuted her observations.
I'd been in the field about 1.5 years when I was told I'd done everything wrong. Chimpanzees should have had numbers, not names. I couldn't talk about them having personality or mind capable of thought, and certainly not emotions. Those were unique to us. I knew the chimpanzees had personalities. I knew that they could think. I knew that they had emotions. And gradually, thanks to my first husband arriving and filming, gradually more and more people began to understand, yes, I was right. The line between us and the rest of the animals wasn't a sharp line. The difference was one of degree, not kind.
This new perspective on animal behavior was reflected in the major protest movements of the 1960s. Militants simultaneously embraced all the major causes: the Vietnam War, racial segregation, women's rights, gay rights, and animal protection. Public opinion began to turn against seal hunting and testing cosmetics on animals.
Stop torturing animals! Most people believe that rabbits are voiceless. Whoa!
In 1980, a group of activists launched a boycott of the US brand Revlon.
That small group of people chose the target of cosmetics because, firstly, nobody can say that cosmetics are something that is necessary for our survival. You know, they are not life-saving medicine. And secondly, test cosmetics, very cruel experiments were done on rabbits. The cosmetics were put directly into the eyes of the rabbits. The rabbits were held in a kind of box with only their head sticking out, so they could not scratch the eye or anything like that. And they were there for days.
At the time, Peter Singer was a young Australian philosopher who had just written a seminal work, Animal Liberation. His book inspired the anti-Revlon activists, along with a whole generation of animal rights supporters. His key message was that it is unfair to not protect animals like rabbits just because they are rabbits. We don't have the right to make them suffer things that we would not do to human beings.
The more conservative traditional animal movement had presented itself as a matter of we should love animals. I was trying to argue, no, this is not something only for animal lovers. It is a basic question of justice or a question of ethics, that we are treating animals wrongly. We are not treating them in the way that they are entitled to be treated. If a being can feel pain, its pain matters. And its pain does not matter less because it is not a member of our species.
Peter Singer's work gave rise to the notion of animal well-being, which is at the core of current regulations. The aim is to prevent unnecessary suffering. A chicken, for example, must not go hungry or thirsty. It must be treated if injured or sick. It must be protected from fear or distress, and must be allowed to behave in a natural way for a chicken. In the Department of Veterinary Science at the University of Bristol, Christine Nichols has spent her research career examining chickens. Her work on poultry well-being has led to changes in European legislation regarding the size of cages used for laying hens.
When I started, there was still lots of battery cages, and the chickens, each chicken had less space to live in than this sheet of paper. So they were really crowded. But on the other hand, farmers and other people were saying they get used to this environment and they've got plenty of food and they're protected from predators and they seem to lay lots of eggs, so what's the problem?
Christine Nichols' work proved that chickens never get used to these cages. She has been championing chicken well-being by working with some exemplary chicken farms, such as Lawn Farm. Here, there are no cages. Rachel Rivers has 1,100 free-range laying hens that have 2 hectares on which to scratch around, explore, and socialize. These are happy chickens, naturally curious ones. They have no fear of humans, and they immediately follow anyone who enters the area they share with a troop of alpacas. They keep the foxes away, and are the perfect companions for the chickens. But there is a paradox about free-range chickens. It's not enough to put chickens outside for them to feel better. Indeed, the mortality rate for free-range chickens is on average higher than for battery hens.
That's a bit embarrassing, because really you would think that all aspects of welfare should be better in a free-range flock. We have too many free-range farms that are still struggling to learn how to manage the free-range birds properly. And on those farms, the health outcomes can be worse, which is not something that people normally think. So it's a big challenge for the industry to meet the consumers' expectations. Consumers don't want birds with behavioural freedom that are also ill. They want healthy birds that have behavioural freedom. You know, you've got to have both.
Because we have more educated consumers, capitalism is having to take more seriously some ethical considerations. Obviously, it is still profit-driven. It cannot not be profit-driven. That is its nature. But the consumers do have the power to influence it very significantly. And what I think we have to do is to try to continue this process of educating consumers to include ethics in their choices.
Free-range animals whose well-being is ensured at every stage of their growth. That's what the most conscientious consumers want, and what advertising generally tends to sell us. However, today, the great majority of animal products we consume come from industrial farms with intensive breeding programs where the animals rarely set foot in a field.
What does well-being mean in that case? I think that raising livestock only makes sense in relation to humans. Raising livestock cannot be industrial.
As a philosopher of science, Francion has examined the relationship between animals and humans, mostly in terms of raising livestock.
Either you talk about raising livestock and you might end up with a very big herd, but it's still raising livestock, that is to say, with someone who raises the animals, or you're talking about something industrial, and the notion of raising livestock no longer applies to the reality you're describing. You're talking about industrial production.
On the plains of Indiana, Fair Oaks Farm reveals the industrial animal production of the future, turned into a show for the American public. The major food production companies have understood what they can get out of the notion of animal well-being as a valuable marketing and sales tool.
I'm sure you've noticed the sand beds. The reason that cows are bedded on sand is that sand is inorganic. That means it will not support bacteria growth. This means it helps protect the cow's udder from infections.
A paradise, they tell you, where 36,000 dairy cattle live. But when animals are transformed into products to this extent, when they are raised by machines and no longer by people, how can one still talk of well-being? For some people, this question of animal well-being actually conceals the real problem. Whether they live well or badly, animals are always exploited for our own interests. American professor and philosopher Gary Francion is the leader of a school of thought that brings together those known as abolitionists.
The animal welfare movement is counterproductive because the message that you give to people is that it's all right for them to continue to consume. If they buy the cage-free egg, if they buy the pig, the pork that has not been produced in a crate, that's okay, that's morally okay. And you see, to me, that's like saying, well, is it better if you beat the slaves, 5 times a week rather than 10 times a week? And the answer is yes, of course it's better, but it doesn't mean that slavery is okay. And it doesn't mean that we should encourage slavery as long as you beat the slaves only 5 times a week and not 10 times a week. There is no happy meat, there is no happy dairy, there are no happy eggs. There's only animal products that are made with more or less torture, that's all. My view is animal ethics means abolishing animal exploitation.
Gary Francion and the abolitionists have another reason to oppose raising livestock in all its form. Whether they are treated well or not, all these animals will end up in the abattoir, like 142 billion animals every year around the world. This end is unacceptable for abolitionists.
Most people have never been in an abattoir, in a slaughterhouse. And, I've been in many of them. And I've been in supposedly good ones. And I've been in supposedly not good ones. And you know what? They're all the same. They're all horrible, horrible, horrible places.
Especially since those shocking videos about what actually goes on in abattoirs have been broadcast in Europe. Slaughtering animals has become a moral issue for the general public. And they are not the only ones asking questions. Those raising the animals are, too. For some small-scale breeders, the issue of death governs their relationship with their animals. Stéphane Caravagno and Muriel Despouhon breed 200 sheep for their wool and their lambs. They offer them an almost ideal life in the mountain pastures. But when it comes to slaughter, farmers feel they lose control. For reasons of hygiene and traceability, they are forced to deliver their animals to abattoirs, which are becoming increasingly big and increasingly industrialized.
We're obliged to send our animals to buildings they don't know, to be killed by people they don't know, and as a result, they experience stress and panic. And that makes us very sad. And more than that, it makes us feel very uncomfortable for them, especially given all that they provide us with. Their meat, their wool for the females. We don't want them to die in that way.
Many farmers who Jocelyne Pochet meets would like to avoid the abattoirs as they are today. A sociologist and researcher at the National Institute for Agronomic Research was once a farmer herself. She is a member of a collective, When Abattoirs Come to the Farm, which fights for alternatives to industrial abattoirs, such as mobile slaughter trucks that visit farms, as practiced in Austria. This allows farmers to take back control over how their animals die.
The entire process is focused on erasing the death. Even when you visit an industrial abattoir, when you listen to their directors, they tell you that the slaughter, the moment when the animal moves from life to death, really is a detail in the process. The abattoir transforms a living animal product into an inert and workable animal product. However, in social terms, this has now become a moral issue. We shouldn't separate animal death from human death, from our global relationship with human death. We no longer see hearses, we die in hospitals, are no longer in our homes. You can't separate that fear of death, or rather denial of death in our society. That denial of death, which is also a denial of animal death, as if we could live without dying, whereas in fact we can't.
For these small-scale farmers, death is all part of the job. They put a great deal of effort into ensuring their animals live as well as they can. But if they cannot guarantee a decent slaughter, where fear and pain are minimized, what is the point?
I think it's possible to allow animals to have a dignified death, where that death takes place in a space where there is meaning. A small abattoir which comes to the farm, for example, there would be a professional slaughterman who would know how to slaughter animals. They would do it the right way, taking the necessary time. Because giving meaning to the slaughter of an animal is about making time, giving us the time to think about what we are doing, giving time to the animal, giving time to the slaughterman, taking the necessary time. It's the opposite of the industrial abattoir where they kill without thinking about what they're doing. It's monstrous.
Abattoirs are monstrous. That's what the abolitionists say too. But for them, it's not just the conditions by which the animals are put to death that are intolerable. It's also the fact of killing them. No more abattoirs, and no more livestock breeding. They reject everything they consider to be a form of animal exploitation. This would be a huge shift for those who work with animals and nature, as shepherds have done for millennia.
If it's no longer worth eating meat from sheep, that means it's no longer worth living with sheep. Is it worth it? What would the mountains be like without sheep? It's a whole. You have to look at it from a historical perspective and an overall geographical one. There are animals in the natural environment and animals in our lives. Are we talking about living without animals?
What would a world look like in which people stopped working with animals? The abolitionists want to demonstrate to as many people as possible that it is indeed possible to live without animal products. That way of life is known as veganism, and the Veggie World Show is the vegan showcase in Paris.
There's yeast, flavorings, there's some champagne. It's an alternative to foie gras. I totally amazed my brother with it at Christmas. It took him a while to realize it wasn't real foie gras.
Fake sausages, fake meat, fake cheese. You can find all the latest vegetable protein substitutes for animal products here. A vegan's imagination has no limits. Egg-free cakes, milk-free cheeses. But this offer of vegan products is much more political than it seems. For abolitionist organizations, it's about the application of ethical choices. And this coherence is behind the success of L214, the association that exposed the practice of crushing chicks, and which regularly stuns public opinion with its shocking videos.
The accessibility of vegan food is key. The more accessible and easy the alternatives, if I can find vegan food just down the street, then I won't hesitate for long. If there's a product there that's come from an abattoir, a salami made from pigs I know have been gassed in an abattoir, and one alongside that is exactly the same but which is 100% vegetable, I can't see how it can keep going for very long. How can the other one continue for long? It's costly in ethical terms and costly in economic terms.
But in an ideal vegan world, what will become of the livestock we no longer need to eat?
The phrase animal liberation is bandied about a great deal, but it's just an image. In the same way we talk about the women's liberation movement and stuff like that. It's not really about releasing animals from farms. It's about stopping them from being born. It's about stopping bringing animals into the world that will be farmed and will feed into the abattoir machine, gobbling up animals, more than 1 billion every year in France. But to my mind, I think it's much more interesting to raise the question and cut the flow of animals at the source.
I think abolitionist movements don't really want to liberate animals. It's more about liberating the animal world. It's about freeing the world of moral dilemmas. But you can't free the world of moral dilemmas, and especially not by just getting rid of what causes a dilemma. I think they are dreaming of an innocent, perfect world.
Can we feed ourselves with all these animals as we have done over previous centuries? Or on the contrary, can we reproduce what many cultures have done by sacrificing as few as possible? The more we find out about how animals think, the more something will become forbidden inside us. Even if there is no law forbidding us to eat animals, something inside us will hold us back.
While we wait for our morality to make us reconsider the lot of animals, laws and rights play a key role in how their status is changing, a status that sometimes leaves a lot to be desired. Piglets with their tails cut off, castrated without anesthesia in front of their mothers that are raging mad. European parliamentarians and representatives of animal rights organizations need to have strong stomachs. On the agenda for this meeting is the well-being of pigs. 95% of all European pigs live in off-the-ground pens where they never see the sun. Tail docking, castration without anesthetic, and tooth filing are permitted in the majority of countries, despite the European Commission having recommended banning these practices years ago.
The Commission doesn't appear to have done what is necessary to make that happen. And I'd like to ask what the reasons for that seeming inactivity are.
We realize there is a problem of enforcement in terms of tail docking, and we are trying to find the best way to address it. We should try to do it by taking everybody on board, and by taking particularly on board the farmers, the ones who will be asked to take measures. Sometimes we should admit also costly measures to implement the legislation.
The European Commission representative, who is a specialist in animal well-being, is cautious. Between the interests of farmers in 28 member states and the wishes of animal protection lobbies, the vote is a close one. Pascal Durand, Green MEP, has heard the Commission's delaying tactics 1,000 times before.
I'm not challenging the good faith of those who defend animal well-being at the Commission. This is not about them. The reality is that they have very little sway, and if there isn't a huge amount of support in relation to these subjects, we will continue to raise animals in these improper conditions. And the term improper is a very generous description, so that certain people will make more money. As soon as it involves money, as soon as it involves the lobbies, be it the farming lobby, the livestock breeding lobby, or the industrial lobby, of course there's massive resistance.
The stakes are huge, because in terms of well-being, it is the European Commission that sets the standards. For MEPs who support animal rights, these regulations are too few and too lax, and above all, are very badly and unevenly enforced by the various member states due to a lack of sufficient checks. When they want the Commission to go further, they are soon brought back to reality. This is what happened when in November 2015, they wanted to question the Commission on the lack of new targets.
We spreken nu over dierenwelzijn. Maar het zou eigenlijk moeten gaan over mensenwelzijn. Vluchtelingen laten we in Europa uren in de kou lopen. Daarbij denk ik aan ouderen en kleine kinderen. Terwijl dieren in transport, verwarming, ventilatie en drinken hebben. Laten we aan de slag gaan met het agendapunt van vandaag. Laten we de mensen helpen en oplossingen zoeken voor de echte crisis in Europa.
Every time we want to ask questions about animal welfare, they raise other urgent issues. But of course, there's unemployment. Of course, there are people living in unbearable conditions. We see that with refugees and with a great number of other subjects. But that takes nothing away from it. Just because there are people suffering, it doesn't mean animals should suffer too. The reality is that there is no such thing as the other thing. Everything is connected. It's about solidarity. It's about our relationship to suffering, our relationships to others, to nature, to living creatures.
In order to combine animal protection with that of humans, in the Netherlands, some animal rights activists have taken a radical decision: to move into politics, with the first political party for animals. On the 8th of March 2015, the day of the provincial elections, the founder and president of the Animal Party, Marianne Timur, is waiting for the results. The Animal Party goes from 7 to 18 seats in the provinces.
Hartelijk dank en heel veel succes. Yes.
Thanks to proportional representation, it has carved out a place in the Dutch political landscape.
When I started the Party for the Animals, a lot of people thought, what's next, a party for plants? And they really were making fun of the party. But as every social movement goes through the same phase, first they ignore you, then they ridicule you, then they want to fight you, and then you win. And we won in 2006. For the first time ever in the world, the Party for the Animals won 2 seats in the national parliament. For the first time ever, there was a party for non-humans.
At the last legislative elections, the Animal Party held on to its 2 seats with 1.9% of the vote. In 2014, it sent 1 MEP to Brussels. Marianne Timur doesn't claim to be on the left or the right, instead presenting her party as one of compassion and sustainability.
Economische groei als de oplossing voor alle problemen, terwijl wij de enige partij zijn die zegt, nee, economische groei is niet de oplossing, maar het is het probleem. If we really want to change the world to a more sustainable planet, then we have to look after the most vulnerable beings on Earth, the animals. We can change the behavior of humans. And we can do that also by law. One of our successes is that there's a budget for innovation for meat alternatives. And it was unthinkable 10 years ago. Another success is that our lower house, our House of Representatives, have voted for our bill to end ritual slaughter without stunning.
It's still too soon to say if Marianne Timur will be able to change things in the long term in the Netherlands. But she has inspired imitators. There are now 16 political parties for animals in the world. But entering the political arena isn't the only way to promote the animal cause. Switzerland has some of the tightest laws on animal protection. This was written into the Constitution as far back as 1973. It also stipulates, and is the only constitution in the world to do so, that animal dignity must be protected. This goes further than affirming that animals have feelings, and has very concrete consequences for Swiss animals and their owners. In pet stores, you cannot buy a single rat.
We sell them in pairs because they need social contact with other members of the same species. It's important for them. There are some animals that cannot tolerate being on their own. They can become depressed, they may stop eating, and actually die. People work all day and often they only take care of their animals in the morning and at night. So having a companion is important.
This obligation extends to all social species. Guinea pigs, gerbils, chinchillas, most rodents cannot be kept as single pets. Animals must also be able to satisfy their basic needs, and must have hiding places and things to nibble. Swiss animal protection laws also forbid the separation of birds that live in pairs, such as budgerigars, which form relationships for life.
This means that animals are not just protected from pain, suffering and harm, they also have the right to be what they are.
Antoan Gchel is a lawyer specializing in animal rights and ensures that all the laws regarding dignity are respected. Between 2007 and 2010, he even held a role in the canton of Zurich that is unique in the world, animal lawyer. During this period, when he was a few years younger and yet to sport a beard, Antoan Gchel was paid by the canton to represent mistreated or abandoned animals in criminal cases. He handled almost 200 cases annually, while in other cantons, such cases could be counted on the fingers of one hand. But above all, he was like a thorn in the side of Swiss justice.
The police, the courts, the prosecutors are all much more involved. They realized that the laws on animal protection must be applied in the same way as we apply environmental or traffic laws. The question is no longer about whether or not to apply them. They are laws like any other.
Antoan Gchel takes initiatives that ensure he is the darling of the media in Switzerland, but which also make him plenty of enemies. On this day, Antoan Gchel faced off against some fishermen who had come to support one of their own. A fisherman who fought for 15 minutes to land an 11-kilo pike. Too much suffering for the pike's lawyer.
It's up to the judge to decide if it was cruel to the fish or not. Because if you did that to a dog or a cat or a cow, then of course it would be cruel. Now it's up to the judge.
The judge did not wish to establish whether or not there had been cruelty towards the pike. The fishermen were relieved.
Sie wissen, wir sind zufrieden, einmal vorerst. Für kurze Zeit. Die nächsten 2 Jahre, bis wir den Lausanne Bericht haben, wahrscheinlich. Aber er hat eine Ohrfeige bekommen.
Antoan Gchel lost that case, and not long after, a referendum against the animal lawyer brought his job to an end. But his work was not in vain. Animal protection is taken increasingly seriously in Switzerland. Elsewhere, it's taking a long time for animal rights legislation to be adopted. But by mobilizing public opinion, organizations hope to gradually make some progress. In August 2014, in front of the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin, PETA, the animal rights organization, tried to raise awareness of passers-by to the plight of wild animals in circuses. They want German law to make their use illegal. The association denounces the condition in which animals are kept. Cages of just a few square meters where big cats, for example, are unable to satisfy their physiological need for open spaces. These animals end up with behavioral problems. And there is nothing uniform or rational about European legislation governing this issue. Some countries forbid such conditions for animals born in their natural environment. Others just for certain species. Some have a ban for all wild animals, and some forbid this for all animals of any species. In France and Germany, there is currently no national legislation with regard to circus animals. What is the basis for legislation with regard to establishing a boundary between what is authorized and what is forbidden? This question is posed under every big top. Bernard Paul is the director of the Roncalli Circus. For 10 years, he ran a big cat number before discontinuing it. This remains an exception in the circus world.
I decided to stop working with wild animals. I think that's the way to go, simply because it's crazy to travel back and forth across Germany with lions and tigers. A giraffe that lives in Africa has a territory covering several hundred kilometers with huge trees. A giraffe in a zoo, in an enclosure, that's wrong. But by saying that, I'll no doubt be attracting the wrath of the other circuses.
But the Roncalli Circus continues to use domestic animals like horses. And when PETA recommends people to boycott circuses with animals, Bernard Paul sees red.
They print posters that say all circuses are cruel to animals. That's like saying all foreigners are criminals. I know lots of people who love their animals more than anything else, and who select those that can be trained. There are domestic animals and wild animals, okay, but humans have lived with animals for millennia.
So what is the answer? Must we give up the emotions that an animal can inspire in us and simply make do with substitutes? Should the boundary marked out by the law distinguish between categories of animal, or is it more complicated than that?
The question is not about animals that are bred or wild ones. It's whether there are animals that seem happy to work with people, and not just with all people, but with good trainers. And there are some animals that are clearly deeply unhappy. But you can immediately see that this distinction doesn't follow a line that separates animals born in captivity and wild animals. It's about much more concrete, more individual boundaries.
What if the way to answer this question was by granting each animal with their own individual rights? Not passive protection rights, but fundamental individual rights like those human beings have with our own human rights and rights as citizens. For now, the judicial system establishes a distinction between objects and people who alone have rights. Animals are not people, so they don't have these fundamental rights. But what if their category were changed, at least for some of them? This is the slightly crazy gamble taken by Steve Weise.
There's a wall in which, right now, all non-human animals are things and all humans are persons. And that's a fundamental distinction in law. It's the same distinction as between a slave and a master. And so right now, if you go in front of a judge, all they're doing is looking at the species and saying the only species that we're going to allow personhood to is human beings. We think that that line is arbitrary, and that what we're now trying to do is break through that wall with any species.
In an attempt to break down this wall, Steve Weise has taken one species, chimpanzees. They have been sufficiently studied to scientifically prove they have the capacity for autonomy and self-determination. And these are the human qualities protected by habeas corpus, that legal principle that covers a fundamental freedom, that we may not be imprisoned without trial. Steve Weise is therefore trying to extend this right to freedom to the chimpanzee. Weise has filed requests for habeas corpus in the name of 4 chimps being kept in shameful conditions. From first requests to appeals, Steve Weise and his association, the Non-Human Rights Project, have fought for 2 years to the fascination of American media.
Chimpanzees are autonomous and self-determining beings. New York common law supremely values autonomy and self-determination, and any human who is autonomous would clearly be allowed to get a writ of habeas corpus but not be imprisoned against her will.
Until now, no judge has agreed to grant the status of a person to a chimp. But there has been massive media interest in the trial, and Steve Weise has been able to explain his theory in the courts.
The only way that humans' fundamental interests are protected is if they are protected by fundamental rights. And that's the exact same thing for a non-human animal. The only way that a non-human animal's fundamental interests will be protected is if she has fundamental rights.
Steve Weise's method has set a precedent. In 2014, Sandra, a 20-year-old female orangutan in Buenos Aires Zoo, obtained what the chimps had been refused, habeas corpus. Argentinian justice considered that Sandra had feelings, that she was a non-human person, and was being illegally deprived of her freedom. Since then, her living conditions at the zoo have been improved. But it is impossible to release Sandra back into the wild, as she is too old and has only ever lived in captivity. A nature reserve would have to take her in. The animal rights strategy has its limits and isn't always met with unanimity.
Of course, these rights will be attributed to certain animals, those we call legally elected animals, such as chimpanzees, maybe dolphins, and a few other particularly charismatic animals. Then what will happen? The boundary that we have between humans and animals will not be questioned at all. On the contrary, I think it will be strengthened. And that's where the problem will be, because in the end, that boundary will be withdrawn for a few. And then will be even more unfair, because it's sure that chimpanzees will end up with rights, whatever rights they may be, but there'll be no rights for rats, few rights for pigs. And where will it end?
There is no clear answer to the question of this boundary. What are the criteria for granting or not granting rights? And moreover, is this demand for rights for animals actually a realistic proposition?
Debating the issue of rights is a good thing. To encourage us to consider some of society's problems, it's necessary to defend extreme positions. In general, society then takes the center ground. But if there were no extreme propositions, nobody would ever wake up.
A wake-up call that's even more necessary because our animal friends need their better conditions now more than ever. Recourse to legislation is one path among many towards achieving this. But the law alone cannot respond to a key question. In the future, what place in our society are we prepared to grant animals?
Pas bouger, gamin.